Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about the processes used to mine minerals and the impacts that those processes have on the environment. Now, a few vocab terms that you'll need to know throughout this unit here is that mining is really just this process of obtaining minerals from the ground. Now, those minerals could be anything from gold to diamonds to gravel to coal. And when we're looking at those minerals themselves, we call that ore. So that raw substance that is extracted from the mine, that would be the ore. Now that ore could be considered a high quality ore or a low quality ore. And that is entirely based upon how much work or refining is going to have to go in to actually extract the final mineral from that ore. So refining is that process to remove the impurities from that ore so that way you get your final product. Now the process of refining takes various forms, and in general it requires a pretty large amount of energy, water, and other resources in order to extract that final product. Now with mining, we also have this waste rock. So when you're mining, there is this rock over the top of that ore, and that would be called the overburden. Then as you remove that overburden and place it somewhere else, we call that then spoils. So the same rock, just when it's been moved to a new location, that would be the spoils. But then after that refining process, as you've taken that ore and broken it down and tried to extract that actual mineral you're after, all of that waste product is referred to as tailings. Now there are two categories of mining. We have surface mining and we have subsurface mining. Now when you think of a mine, you're probably thinking of a subsurface mine or that underground tunnel. Now in reality, most mines today are not that subsurface tunnel. Most mining of resources in the United States takes place in a surface mine. And that's because tunneling through the ground is really dangerous and really expensive. So we try to avoid doing that. Now there are three categories of surface mining that you need to know for the AP exam, and we'll go through them one at a time. We have strip mining, open pit mining, and mountaintop removal. So the first one we'll talk about here is the open pit mine. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It is a giant hole in the ground. And what happens is these very large mining trucks will go into the mine, will have some explosives to break apart the walls of the mine, and slowly make a larger and larger pit to extract the actual minerals that you're after. Now there are several pretty substantial environmental issues associated with this, and as you can see in the aerial photograph on here, we're going to have a huge amount of soil that is exposed and displaced or moved to another location, and in the process we are going to destroy a whole lot of habitat in the process. So those are just two of the big environmental issues associated with open pit mining. The second type is called a strip mine. Now this is kind of similar to an open pit. However, instead of just going deeper and deeper in this cone into the earth, with strip mining you are still using very large equipment, but you are going in strips across the landscape. Now this has similar environmental impacts to open pit mining, and these strip mines are also extremely large. So if you look at that large piece of equipment in the bottom right corner of the screen, those buckets are moving around on the wheel. You can actually see a couple ladders going up on that equipment, and that helps you to get a little bit of a scale of the size of how large these operations truly are. The third type is mountaintop removal. Now, mountaintop removal again is exactly what it sounds like. We are cutting off or removing the entire top of a mountain in order to access the ore that is stored within. Now, typically with mountaintop removal, we're looking at the Appalachian Mountains, so eastern part of the United States, where we are searching for coal. Now, this does happen in other places around the world, but that's where we're primarily focusing within the scope of this class. Now again, these are huge operations. They can be seen from space. And I want you to take a moment and look at the diagram on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can see just step by step kind of how this process happens and start thinking about the environmental impacts of this, because a lot of those impacts are the same as the other forms of mining. Now, after you extract your ore, you need to process it and get your target material. Otherwise, what's the purpose of just taking this raw rock? So refining is a multi-step process, and it is different depending on the type of ore and your type of target material. Now, in general, you start with your ore, you go through several steps to process that to remove impurities, and then you're going to end with the target material. Now again, this diagram here, it shows a variety of the steps that might take place. You do not need to know the individual steps, just the overall idea that you start with ore, remove the impurities, end with your target material. Now I do want to talk briefly about a specific process within refining that does have a very significant environmental impact. Now that process is called cyanide heap leaching. So again, you start with a big pile of ore and you're adding this fluid to the top through a sprinkler system. And that fluid contains cyanide. Yeah, cyanide, not very good for human health or the environmental health. And what happens is it leaches through that pile and it dissolves away any kind of impurities to leave behind your target material. But as that liquid goes through and picks up those impurities, we need to collect that material at the end and then reprocess it. But in that process of reprocessing, we're extracting these impurities, but we're not able to remove all of the cyanide. So that cyanide slurry is super duper bad for the environment. So we consider that a dangerous environmental hazard. Now again, there are many environmental consequences of mining. For starters, you scrape away that topsoil, so you have this bare earth, and that can lead to a lot of erosion. There's no longer that plant material holding the soil in place. We also have roads that are moving those trucks in and out, but they can also carry invasive species with them. That mining equipment is huge. Many of those mining trucks are larger than a pretty large size single-family home. Also, a lot of that erosion is going to pollute those rivers, and it's going to mostly carry extra soil into the rivers, which increases the turbidity. Now, turbidity means that there's a lot of solids suspended in the water column, and that sunlight's not able to penetrate through very easily. Now, keep in mind with mining, you're probably not going to see an increase in nutrients. The bigger impact here is that soil coming into the water, and that's going to increase the turbidity. Acid mine drainage is also an environmental impact of mining. Now, acid mine drainage is associated with old abandoned mines. So what happens here is the tailings and some of that waste rock from the old mine is piled up outside of the mine entrance. And if we're looking at that tailings, oftentimes it's going to contain iron and sulfur compounds. So what happens here is those compounds are going to react with oxygen and water to produce an acid. And that acid is going to leach out from that waste rock pile and move downstream towards the river. Now, as that acid moves down slope, it's going to pick up heavy metals and other toxins in its path and carry them into the river. And this results in that acid ending up in the river and all that nasty stuff it picked up along the way, and that leads to pretty significant environmental impacts in that river. Particularly, we're going to see a lot of the organisms die off very quickly. Now, it's not all bad news. We do have what's called mine remediation. And in fact, any new mine today has to prove to the landowners and oftentimes to the U.S. Forest Service or U.S. Department of the Interior or U.S. Department of Agriculture, or really just any regulating agency, that they have the ability and the follow-through to return that land back to how it was before. So this is the process of remediation, or returning back to the way things were before the disturbance happened. Now, this is not cheap to do. It is quite expensive, but this is the only way to ensure that our global need for these minerals and resources is not going to completely destroy the earth. Now, it's not always possible to return the landscape exactly back to the way it was before. Sometimes instead of returning it back to a forested landscape, perhaps it is returned back towards a park or towards a golf course. So some type of natural-esque environment that is able to be used, and it's not just a large waste site. Now, there is federal and state legislation that requires mining companies to do this. The mining legislation mostly here is looking at the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, so that way while that mine operation is happening, the waters are protected. They have to constantly monitor, and if anything starts to get out of whack, they have to immediately remediate that situation. We also have the Endangered Species Act that ensures that these mines are not in locations that are going to disturb the habitat of threatened or endangered species. We also have this act called CERCLA, and this is also known as the Superfund Act. This is an act that puts a tax on certain industries, and that money then goes towards focusing on making sure those companies remediate any environmental damage. And if the responsible party for some reason goes bankrupt or somehow disappears, this provides federal monies to remediate that hazardous waste site. Additionally, we have the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. And this is primarily focusing on coal mines and making sure that they are following all of these other rules and regulations, and that they are indeed remediating after they are done extracting the minerals. So in summary, and I have a couple summary slides on here, make sure you know the definitions of mining, refining, overburden, spoils, or tailings. Be able to describe open pit, strip mining, and mountaintop removal. Also that subsurface mining, which is kind of digging tunnels. And that process of refining called cyanide heap leaching. Really just know what is the danger associated with that and why do we do it. Also, keep in mind that mining has environmental consequences, and some of those consequences that we talked about in this video. Additionally, any mine damage can be remediated. We can make things better, so it's not all doom and gloom. Some of the things to do would be to reestablish vegetation, make sure the land is sloped or graded appropriately, making sure we actually have topsoil back on the surface, and if there was any type of acid mine drainage, we need to be able to remediate that. So a few things we could do would be to bring that pH back towards neutral, because remember, an acid has a very low pH, so we want to raise it back up by adding a base. Also removing those tailings piles, and we can do this process called bioremediation. So I know this was a lot of information. Please go back and rewatch any sections or some of your questions, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.